Hello.
Okay, everyone, can I ask you to please take your seats? We're ready to start.
Hello.
Okay, before we start the session on trade, I just wanted to talk through the agenda for the rest of the day, just so it's clear to everyone how it's going to work. Hopefully you've all got a copy of the agenda in front of you. So we'll hear from our panelists, and Jeff Gleeson, who's the Economic Counsellor at the Embassy, will be moderating for us. The panelists will give their presentations, then there'll be an opportunity for questions. And straight after that, we're going to break into 8 groups. So there are 8 flip charts around the room, and there are 8 facilitators. If I can ask you all to move to one of those groups, ideally not with people from your country. And the focus of the workshop after this panel will be more generally around the network. And having some really open discussions about how we can strengthen the Chevening alumni network in the region, and coming up with some proposals, namely one objective and one principle for how we see the network going forward. We'll have about 20 to 30 minutes, ideally, of that discussion, and then we'll ask one person from each group just to very quickly stand up and say what from their group was kind of the main outcome of that discussion. We'll then move into lunch, and then we'll have the second panel of the day on anti-corruption. After that panel and the Q&A, there will be an opportunity, again in small groups, to talk both about the trade, the trade conclusions and the anti-corruption conclusions. And your facilitators will moderate that for you and make sure that there's an opportunity to talk about both topics in detail. I know we've had loads of great ideas coming forward throughout the course of the morning for other topics you'd like to discuss or other groupings you'd like to create. Can I please suggest that we have got lots of networking spaces in this agenda. We've got lunches, we've got coffee breaks, we've got the reception tonight. Can I please suggest that you all feel free to kind of take forward those discussions in those networking spaces, whether that's different groupings of people that you want to get together. Just leave that to you, really, to organise that in the space you've got available. If you feel that there's not going to be an opportunity and you want to try and find space in the agenda, by all means come back to us. But as you can see, the agenda is pretty packed already. And I think that's probably the best use of everyone's time. But very happy for people to come and talk to me about that. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to Jeff.
Okay, good morning, everyone. As Nicola said, my name is Jeff Gleeson. I'm most recently the Economic Counsellor in the British Embassy in Bogota, but I spent about 3.5 years as the Deputy Head of Mission. I want to say a couple of things. Firstly, I don't know if anybody has been in the UK far back enough to remember a show called Blind Date, but it kind of was the show where you had 3 guys or three women basically sitting on seats like these with a screen on the other side and somebody of the opposite sex. We weren't progressive enough to have same-sex things at that time, but you all had to answer kind of quite trivial questions and try and include as many innuendos as you possibly could in your answers. It was kind of embarrassing, and that's pretty much what this feels like. Throughout my time in the embassy in Bogota, I've been a huge supporter of the Chevening program, and I'm really delighted that we're hosting this conference, this regional conference in Bogota. I think it's testament to all the work of Catalina Sabogal and her team, and the Chevening Alumni Association in Bogota, or in Colombia rather. So thank you very much to all of you who've participated and all of you who've come from far afield to be here this morning and over the next couple of days. I think it's a really exciting time for Chevening in Latin America, and I hope that it continues to thrive. I wanted to make one kind of slightly outside of trade policy announcement, and just to celebrate the fact that today is Lisette Foronda's 25th year, or the exact day of her 25th anniversary working for the British Embassy in La Paz. So congratulations, Lisette. And now I'm going to get into the panel. So we have three very distinguished guests. You can all read their profiles in these little pamphlets and agendas. So I'm not gonna kind of just read out their biographies, but welcome to Rafael, Federico, and Francisco. I think in the context of trade, there's a sort of Chinese curse which says that may you live in interesting times. And these are definitely interesting times in the context of global trade, both in terms of trade policy and more generally trade and investment and commerce globally. So there's some really big trends happening in the world. There is a American president who is quite erratic on trade, who has announced intentions to introduce tariffs on aluminium and on steel, who's pulled out of the TPP. You have Brexit in the UK, which is not really a trade, or is not has the vote for Brexit wasn't necessarily driven with trade in mind, but it has huge implications for trade. And one of my jobs in the embassy has been to work with Colombia and along with colleagues in Lima and in Quito to look at the trade deal that the EU has with those three countries, and trying to make sure that we don't lose the market access on both sides that trade deal offers after the UK leaves the EU. So, and that initiative is happening across the world in countries where the UK has trade agreements, or where the EU rather has trade agreements with third countries, and where the UK maintains its ambition and objective to keep those trade relationships as open and ambitious as possible. So that's something that when we get into some of the Q&A and some of the discussion, I'm happy to also talk about the UK's outlook on trade. But if you hear British politicians and the UK government, the narrative around Brexit is very much a narrative of global Britain. I'm sure you've heard that already. That this is not an inward-looking move by the UK. Rather, it's an opportunity for us to be even more global, to look into markets where real growth is going to take place over the next 10 or 20 years, and where we can be more ambitious and more open, and a more free trading nation than we've ever been. So there are sort of protectionist impulses that are going on in the world, but there are also even more free trade impulses that are happening. And what I'd like to do in this panel is firstly give all the panelists an opportunity to say, to either make some presentations or to say a few words for around 10 minutes maximum, but shorter if you would like, panelists. And then I will try and provoke a bit of interaction between the panelists, asking some questions, then I'll open it up to Q&A from all of you. So I'm going to hand over firstly to Rafael, who's got some slides and a presentation prepared. So thank you very much, Rafael.
Okay. Well, thanks, Jeff, and big thanks to the embassy and the ambassador for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be in such an interesting and valuable group as the Chevening alumni, two of which are also standing here in the panel. So it's a great pleasure to be here. I want to give you perhaps some words regarding sort of the economic development side of trade and trade opportunities, because that's mostly what our work at the Private Council on Competitiveness does for Colombia. So I'm going to try to talk about issues and opportunities for trade in Latin America. You're going to see that I want to show you some data and some thoughts on Latin America, but of course I will draw some more information from Colombia because that's where we focus on. But I hope that this leaves some key points for discussion regarding, again, sort of the economic development side of trade. So I want to start with, let me see if this works. First, opportunities. I think opportunities are very clear, and just a parenthesis, this is probably the largest screen I've ever seen in a conference, so it's a bit tempting to look behind, but I hope you see what I'm pointing towards here. So the first one is clearly the region is one in which there's a robust and emerging middle class. This is basically one of the big structural changes that has happened throughout Latin America, and it's a big part of the world population that is leaving poverty behind and is sort of starting to be part of a true globalized world. That's probably the biggest opportunity for trade in our region. The second one is, I think, biodiversity, natural resources, and agriculture truly provide a sort of an opportunity for having a rich, value-added green export sector. And the final one, which you won't see because of the chairs, is that some factor conditions in some countries in terms of geographical position, in terms of market liberalization, in terms of macroeconomic stability, provide an opportunity for higher trade patterns. And I think those are key opportunities that I'm sure we'll discuss. In terms of the middle class, the data for Colombia, just to show you how big this change is, in just 16 years, Colombia's middle class has doubled. It was 16% back in 2002. And after sort of a few years of economic progress, we're now at something like 31% middle class. So this is a big change, doubled in terms of the size of the population, and it's a structural change in which it has surpassed the share of the poor for the first time. Now I want to go to barriers and challenges for trade. I want to talk about three specific challenges that we see at the Council. The first one is that even though our economies in the region have, quote unquote, opened to trade, Latin American countries are still relatively closed and are still not fully embedded in economic trade. The second one is logistics and infrastructure. It's still a big lag, and Latin American countries still have a lot of work to do in terms of tapping the benefits of global trade. And the final one is that our low productivity and our sort of low capacity for entrepreneurial activity is also keeping countries like Colombia, but others, with some exceptions, to have products that are truly competitive at a global level. So I want to just show you some data on the three, and then I'll finish this first presentation. In terms of having opened, there's one data that for me is key, and it's that in 1990, Colombia opened up for trade. And I always say, quote unquote, opened up for trade, because in 1990, the share of exports and imports to GDP was something like 35%. Today, it's 34.7%. So we have definitely lowered our tariffs, but at the same time, we've had some of a counter reform to subject imports and exports to regulatory barriers that have sort of proven to be a challenge for us to really open up to trade. So even though tariffs are down, when you see actual flows of exports and imports, we haven't really gone up, and it's probably related to regulatory barriers. The second one, I talked about logistics and infrastructure. In terms of infrastructure, this is a map where you can show, and maybe you can see your country there in the ranking in the World Economic Forum's infrastructure pillar. Colombia is 109th between 138 countries that are ranked. Some countries in Latin America are have higher performance, like Chile or Ecuador, but in general, we are very high up in rankings, so very low performance in terms of general infrastructure in Latin America. In Colombia, this is probably best shown by a picture. This is the map of the density of roads in Colombia, and what you see is that we have basically a half of the country is covered by roads, where it's highways or local roads, and the other half is just completely separated from the markets and from development. And then when you take out coal, which has its sort of private railroads, 98% of Colombian shipments are carried on roads, which are the most expensive and the most vulnerable to climate change. So we still have a big task to do in terms of development infrastructure for transport. And also in terms of logistics, this is another interesting map in which we highlight the average age of trucks in each country. In Colombia, we have a huge problem in which our trucks are on average 21 years old. This is basically a signal of how inefficient our logistics are, but this is not also the case in other countries. In Mexico, it's 17 years. In Nicaragua, it's 23 years. And then when you compare, the UK is 5 years average age of trucks, Portugal 7 years, France 8 years. So we have a big gap in terms of how modern our logistics sector is. And this, I think it's also a hindrance on trade. And then just to close up, in terms of productivity and entrepreneurial capacity, this is again a key factor that I think explains our low numbers in terms of exports and imports, and it's related to productivity. Productivity, when you see the data on total factor productivity in Latin America, this is not only the case of Colombia, but it's also Peru, Brazil, Mexico, Chile. We've had stagnated productivity in the past decade, with even some decrease years in terms of productivity. And then this is a big problem because productivity is the key driver of economic growth. When you see the case of China, we always hear that China grew because they had cheap labor and then they could grow and take over markets. But the reality is, when you see why they grew at 9% every year for 16 years, the reality is that part of it, the part that is explained by jobs, is only 0.6%. 5% was on investment in capital, and then 3 points was just because of productivity. And when you see the data on Latin America and Colombia, productivity is actually decreasing growth. So we have a big task to do there. I'm going to skip this next 2 slides, which is perhaps too much information for this. I'll come back to this maybe in the questions. But I think in conclusion, there are clear opportunities for Latin American countries to become a key player in global trade. But before those opportunities are realized, this is not just about having some grandiose statements about how are we going to open up our economies. Before we actually make those opportunities come true, I think we need to focus on those 3 issues: regulation and a true openness to trade in terms of bringing down regulatory barriers to trade. Second, a big focus on infrastructure and logistics. We do not only have to think about the highways, but also how efficiently are we using those highways and ports. And third, productivity and how sophisticated and diversified our exports are. And that's also a key issue for sort of productive development policies if we want to take advantage of those opportunities for trade. So those are some thoughts from the economic view on trade.
Thank you very much. And I'm gonna, I think, mix things up. I'm gonna ask Francisco, so that we don't have 2 Colombians speaking one after each other. I'm gonna ask Francisco to just give us a Brazil perspective on all of this. Francisco is a lawyer, works with a lot of international clients and bringing UK investment into Brazil. So I think from a perspective of your clients and from a perspective of your region, just to say a few words about where you see the opportunities and the challenges.
Sure. Thank you, Jeff. Well, thank you for Chevening, not only for the opportunity to be here, but also for the opportunity to get a higher education at the LSE in London back in 2004. This really was an amazing experience and something that changed my life. It's great to be here. It's great to be able to talk about business opportunities in Brazil. But I think what's really interesting, given the audience that we have over here today, is maybe to take a step back and talk a little bit about the environment and the political economical situation in Brazil in the last couple of years, because this really changed the landscape and set, I think, the scene for the business opportunities that we have over there right now. And we're going to talk about 2 main events. The first one is a very famous one. I'm sure you all heard about it. It's the Lava Jato operation, or the car wash operation, and the change in government that we suffered in the middle of the term for Dilma Rousseff's mandate. And then at the end, we're going to talk about the government that we have now and the business opportunities that we have at the moment. So starting with Lava Jato, I don't know if you all know that, but it started as a very small investigation into the transactions of a local chain of petrol and car wash stations in Brasilia, a capital city. And then it developed in I think the biggest corruption scandal that the country has seen in its history. In very small, very little words, it was basically about a cartel of big construction companies in Brazil getting together and, in effect, bribing Petrobras officials in exchange for contracts, for winning contracts with Petrobras to construct Petrobras facilities. This really was a major landmark for Brazil because it was really the first time that it was shown that it was possible to fight corruption. I think many factors could explain that, but basically the fact that all the investigations were conducted by the same first instance judge, which was not prone to political pressures. Also the public support that the investigations got from very early stages, and also the use of new investigation tools such as the plea bargaining agreements, which was really instrumental in getting the evidence that was necessary to conclude investigations. This eventually produced results that were never before seen in Brazil. For the first time, we saw top politicians, top executives of state-owned companies, top executives of private companies being sent to prison. We have Marcelo Odebrecht sent to prison, and now probably we're going to see our former President Lula going to prison shortly as well. So all of this is, of course, it's very important to show that it's possible to tackle corruption. And in the long term, it's really something that is very positive for the country and for the region, I think. But on the other hand, if you look at the short term and the medium term effects of all of that, you can see that it really turned something that the country was already in a difficult financial situation, and it really finds itself in, I think, a perfect storm of elements, because it already had to deal with low commodity prices before that, a reduction in government spending because of the crisis, and also a decrease in consumer activity. And then it was faced with three new elements, which was a standstill investments by Petrobras. All the largest construction companies in the country were in the brink of bankruptcy, as they were denied access to contracts and access to financing as well. And there was a general lack of confidence in what the country could do economically. This perfect storm really required a response from government or for Congress. And that response eventually came in the form of the impeachment of the former president of Dilma Rousseff. The reality was that back in 2004, Dilma had won the elections by a very narrow margin, which showed a big divide in the voters' desires. And once the Lava Jato operation made it clear that top officials of the Labour Party had been involved in the corruption scandals, and the fact also that the Labour Party had been there in power for 12 years and effectively controlled Petrobras for all of that time, made it clear that something had to be done. So the impeachment was eventually approved by the Congress, and we had a new president, Mr. Michel Temer. He was sworn into presidency in August 2016 with a very short mandate, which finishes late this year, in 31st December 2018. Mr. Temer said many times that he's not going to run for re-election, and that his main mandate was really to take the measures that were required to regain investors' confidence. He did chose some very capable individuals to head the initiatives in his government. He chose Henrique Meirelles to be the finance minister, who is the former head of Bank Boston's global operations, and also Ilan Goldfein to be his central bank president. And Ilan is the former chief economist of Banco Itaú. Many actions had already been taken to boost foreign and domestic investment, and changes to the regulations in strategic areas to really give more incentives to foreign and domestic investments have already been done in oil and gas sector, investment in land, investment in infrastructure such as airports and roads. to speak a little bit about the oil and gas sector specifically, because it's very important for the region and also for trade and investment with the UK. A very important change has been made in relation to the exploitation of oil and gas in the pre-salt areas. A change in the law now makes it possible for foreign companies to own and operate 100% of pre-salt oil fields, which was not possible based on the previous law. The local content requirements were also reviewed, and we now have a very clear schedule for new bidding rounds for oil fields. There will be 6 new bidding rounds in the next couple of years that will probably attract a lot of interest from foreign investors. In addition to that, as you probably know, Petrobras has launched a very aggressive divestment plan. Many assets are on sale. Currently, there is the sale of TAG, which is the gas pipeline network that operates in the northeast and the north area of Brazil. Petrobras says it's going to sell a stake in its fuels distribution company as well, which is BR Distribuidora. There is many sales of rights over oil fields that are already producing oil. And in addition to that, the government has launched an aggressive privatization program. The privatization of the state-owned electric power company, Eletrobras, should happen yet this year. And the privatization of state electric power distribution companies is already on the way. So I think the current signs of growth that the Brazilian economy is showing shows that the measures that have been taken by the current government have produced positive results. But the government is not free from criticism. Some of its representatives have also been involved in the later stages of the Lava Jato investigations, and that eventually undermined the confidence over this government to pass some more structural reforms, such as the social security reform and tax reform. So this is going to be left to the next government. And the big if at the moment is really what the new government will look like. We're going to have elections in October. Candidates have until April, late April, to register their candidacies. And so far, if you ask me, I don't think anyone in Brazil could give you an answer on who will be the front runners and how the political game will happen. So there are still many uncertainties there, but we need to see what happens. And thank you very much.
Is that working? Yeah. Francisco, thank you very much for that really thought-provoking and insightful exposition of what's happening in Brazil, which, as we all know, is the biggest economy in the biggest country in the region, and in many ways sets the tone for how people in outside of Latin America see Latin America in terms of both its politics and its economics. So it's a real bellwether in terms of investment and political interest. I'm going to ask Frederico Torres, who's a good friend of the embassy, both as an ex-Chevening scholar, but also as the head of Arup in Colombia, which is a big British company, which I think is present across the entire region, at least in terms of projects. Just to say a little bit about the experience of a British company operating in the region, and any other comments that you want to have on what the others have said and the opening remarks that I made.
Thank you, Jeff. Good morning, everyone. My name is Federico Torres. I am the country manager for Arup in Colombia. It's in engineering a very important British company, really well known in the UK and Europe and around the world. If I'm allowed to, I want to change a little bit and take 5 minutes to tell a little my story. And it's not that I want to talk about me. So, like, in a very British way, I need to apologize in advance to use this time. But I have been to a lot of British Embassy events and some Chevening events, not that much, and I have never had the opportunity to say thank you to Chevening for the opportunities I have and for the British Embassy. So I want to take 5 minutes to do this, taking a little bit my story and the relationship I have with the UK. And I want to start saying that it started in 1996 when I was 18 years old. Because I'm a squash player. I play squash I have played squash all my life, so in a decent level in Colombia, in a good level in Colombia. And I don't know how many of you know about sports, but British is very important. And the best squash is played in the UK. And the most important tournament is the British Open. It's like the Wimbledon of squash. So my dream as a kid was to go to the British Open. I had the chance to go there and play the Junior British Open, and it was the Scottish British Open, and the following week the British Open. I didn't do that well because it was top level, but I had the opportunity to travel to the UK, to Edinburgh and Sheffield, and to play at the top level, top junior level at the squash. And I completely love the UK, London, squash, my sport over there, and I said I have to come back here. I have to find a way to come back here. Of course, I couldn't live playing squash. It's a sport that it doesn't give you a life. It's very difficult to do that, especially in these type of countries. And this is where I'm going to talk a little about trade. It's education trade and sport trades. So I had to study. I studied civil engineering. And when I finished, the first thing I did was go back to the UK. I had some savings, and I had enough money to go to the UK for 4 months and go and play squash again. So I went there for 4 months, used all my savings. I live in Guildford, close to London, and because all the top players, squash players in the world, live in London or around London. So I had a fantastic experience playing tournaments and training with a team over there in London, and that was also part of my dream to play as a semi-professional player, live in London playing squash. I only had money for 4 months, so I had to go back and I had to look for a job. But again, I said I had to come back. I had to find an excuse to go back and live in London. That's where I say, okay, now I have a degree, I need a master's, so I look for an interesting master in my field, it's transport, and I started looking for scholarships. And we applied to a lot of scholarships, and I was able to win the Chevening scholarships. That was one, or the best scholarship that was available at the time. We were very lucky because I was about to get married, and my wife also won a Chevening scholarship. So there were, that year, 2007, there were 7 scholarships, and we were about to get married, and we had 2 out of the 7. So we were very worried that they were going to say, you cannot have 2 out of the 7 scholarships because it's the same family, or it's going to become the same family, because we got married 3 weeks before flying to London to do our studies. So I'm really grateful to Chevening because he gave me that opportunity to follow my dream of going back to the UK. Sports, I continue to play, but now I was more into my professional career, engineering. And we live in London, was fantastic experience, like many of you should have. Then my wife had the opportunity to do a PhD. So I had to talk with Chevening, and I shouldn't say this here, but we needed to stay some extra time because my wife had the opportunity to do a PhD, and Chevening allowed me, that wasn't part of the rules at the beginning, to stay for more time in London, waiting until my wife finished her PhD. I found a job with a British company, Stuart Davis Glyph, a very well-known also British company. And while my wife was finishing her PhD, it was a fantastic experience also doing that. And then we came back to Colombia as I was planning at the beginning some years later, and there was opportunity for Arup. Arup is one of the top engineering companies. They wanted to open an office in Colombia, so they looked for me. They have told me some years later that they went to the British Embassy and they asked for me, and the British Embassy, someone looked for me, and they said, oh, he's a Chevening scholar, we know him, so yes, he's a good candidate. So they also helped me with that. And I have been working with Arup for 4 years. So the last 10 years I have been working for British companies. I studied there. I did all my sports there, and for me that's a lot of trade. It's a different type of trade, but that's a different trade that starts everything. And I just want to take this opportunity to tell the story a little bit and really say thank you to the British Embassy and to Chevening, because I myself and my wife will not have the current jobs that we have in Colombia, that were in really good jobs, without all the support of Chevening, of those initial studies, and also for the British Embassy to support us in all these stages. So that's I wanted to change a little bit that, and apologies again for doing this a little bit personal, but it was I thought this was the perfect opportunity to say thank you to Chevening and the British Embassy.
Uplifting story about how Chevening has helped keep a marriage together. So I think congratulations. When Federico was talking, it reminded me a little bit of the many, well, I want to say hundreds, but it's not quite hundreds of times that I've interviewed people for Chevening. And if you remember, there are, I'm sure you'll all remember this, there are sort of 4 questions that we always ask around leadership, networking, links to the UK, and then there's one on career plans. I'm gonna leave the career plan out, and I'm gonna focus in on those 3 other categories to try and shape this discussion. So the first is leadership, and what I want to ask the panelists is, given where we are globally on trade, with particularly what's happening in the United States, it feels to me a little bit like there's an opportunity for some Latin American leadership around free trade, and that seems to be particularly driven at the moment by the Pacific Alliance Group, where you have 4 very progressive, open economies, successful economies that are starting to take baby steps into negotiating trade deals of their own with Canada, Singapore, the US, New Zealand. Do you see, and I guess this is to all the panelists, do you see that change happening? Do you feel that Latin America, which has previously been perceived as one of the more protectionist parts of the world, can actually take some kind of global leadership, and if not global, then at least regional leadership in promoting more openness to trade? And I'll come on to my 3rd category a bit later around the links to the UK, but there are obvious questions as well around how the UK can be a part of that, especially given what's going on in terms of Brexit. I don't know who would like to take that first. Federico?
Okay. About our different countries, I think one thing that I always try to clarify, especially when talking with colleagues of my company, is that yes, we are close, we're Latin America, but we're very different. We speak the same language. A lot of time, if it happened to you, I say, oh, okay, I'm from Colombia. I say, okay, I know someone from Chile. Do you know him? And I say, hey, he's 6 hours away. Very even so first is people need to understand that yes, we are close, but we are very different, even if we speak the same language. We have a lot of links together, and we need it. We are developing, so we can, if we respect those differences that the different countries has, I think we can work as a bloc. And I really think we can have the leadership. And a good example I always use was in 2008, 2009, when there was this world crisis about the finance crisis and everything that started in the US. I don't think that hit us Latin America very well. And I don't think it don't hit us very hard. And it was because we're used to crisis. Is that the economy doesn't grow? That happens a lot in these countries, or things go down. We're used to that, and that helped us a lot to be able to answer in a better position that big crisis that was happening in the world. So I think we could have an alliance. It would be good. I think we have some issues with some countries, with Venezuela specifically, that we need to. There needs to be a way to change that. But I think we're countries that need development. There has been a lot of changes in all the countries around. And if they work together, or we work together, there's a lot we can do.
Even though we don't speak the same language, because I speak Portuguese, I think there is a lot of potential for leadership. Of course, political will is required there, and I think all the governments should have some sort of alignment in terms of how they see free trade happening, but certainly something that that could happen, in my point of view.
Do you see a shift in Brazil in particular in terms of their outlook towards free trade?
I see it, but it really depends on who will be on the top position in government this next time. I'm really confident that, of course, the expectation is going to be an outsider. It's not going to be someone that has been in the political establishment for some time, and an outsider would hopefully look at free trade opportunities as something that should be in the top of their agenda.
I think I agree completely that, I mean, part of what makes leadership in terms of multiple countries participating in something like the Pacific Alliance requires, almost by definition, sort of stability in terms of institutions, instead of a view of what those countries share. And I think at the moment we have that in the Pacific Alliance. That is sort of one force that is starting to grow. Because the other one has always been Brazil, because, as you said, because of the sheer size and importance of the economy, it marks it's sort of the big country that is marching in front of the region. But I think Pacific Alliance is a very interesting way to align interests, align views, align forces with a long-term goal that is basically revolves around trade, but also development, or the same view on what development is. But if that alliance is, I mean, if it is put in danger because of an election in a country, we also have elections here in May, so right around the corner. If you change those long-term rules, views about what is development, those sort of alliances very quickly can be shattered, and then you again go back to relying on just sheer force of your individual countries. So I hope that, and you said it at the beginning, sort of political and institutional quality is key to achieving those long-term goals. And if we can sort of figure out how to have some stability in terms of our institutions, I think we do have a big role in terms of being leaders. If we are back into just having cycles of political energy and then go back to some crisis that change the model, then I think we don't have much of a chance.
Yeah, I think trade and investment are very much aligned there. I think stable rules that survive the change of the government of the day are really important, because and maybe a way of achieving that is, I don't know, creating some sort of an independent agents that would deal with trade issues as some countries have in relation to investment. So that could be a good opportunity there.
And I think going back to something that Federico said that I think is key here, and it's that sometimes if you receive a big shock as a country, then you can sort of wake up to these institutional realities and into these long-term realities. I can talk in terms of Colombia, the sort of the commodity price shock that we received in 2014 was sort of a wake-up call for government, for companies, for civil society to start thinking, maybe we don't rely anymore on this just mining and oil to survive and to be part of this global trade, and we need to think sort of more clearly about our institutions, our productivity, our sort of more sophisticated exports. So I do think our Latin American countries need those types of shocks. I'm sort of a bit worried that if oil is already starting to go up, the shock hasn't done its job sufficiently well yet. We may have another government that comes in, has a high price of oil, and then they don't have to worry about all these difficult long-term problems again, and so we lose momentum.
Yeah. Just staying on, I guess, a similar theme, and going a little bit to what you were mentioning, Rafael, in your presentation around levels of productivity, and I think we're talking also about the impetus for economic reforms in the region. Seems to me, from an outsider's perspective, that there's a lot of money on the table when it comes to raising the productive capacity of pretty much every economy in this region. And there's excessive amounts of bureaucracy, there's regulation for things. I mean, just, you only have to, and Colombia is not the most regulated or the most bureaucratic country in this region. But I still find that, you know, just to get into a building, I have to give my cedula 6 times. And it just feels like there's a duplication, not even at a policy level, but just purely at an administrative level. There has been no drive to clean up the regulatory environment in a way that takes the sand out of the wheels of doing business. And for me, staying on the theme of leadership, there feels like a failure of leadership across all of the economies in this region to actually do something to raise levels of productivity, to enhance competition, to make labor markets more flexible, to drive innovation, all of those kind of key drivers of productivity. So is it a failure of political leadership, or is it just vested interests or inertia? What's missing in this economic environment to create that impulse? Federico, you look keen to answer that.
I want to complement what you were saying. I agree, it's very difficult, taxes, it's very bureaucratic. I try to always look at the positive side of things. However, we are having trade, we are doing business, we are progressing, Colombia is exporting, importing, so there are a lot of happening going on. And I will add something to your things that don't work quite well, is that probably people in Colombia are aware that it's very expensive to bring things to Bogota. Bogota is in the middle of the mountains, in the middle of the country. So to bring things from the ports, Caribbean coast or Pacific coast to the city is sometimes for some things more expensive than to bring it from China. So from China to Cartagena is one thing, from Cartagena to here is things, you could double the price. However, we are still, with all those constraints, we are still doing some trade, and the country is doing something in that topic. That is my topic, is they're improving the infrastructure. It's very expensive because the infrastructure is very old, but now with the whole peace process and that the government can focus on different things, there is a big program on infrastructure going on that is completely changing that. So the competitiveness of Colombia in that part is going to increase a lot. With some other things that your topic that you were saying, that there are some willingness to improve. The thing is, we come from a Latin culture where bureaucratic is there, it has to be, and if you go work in the public sector, is the way to work. So, but that is changing. That is, look at the Bogota government is a good example. With Peñalosa, a lot of very good people has entered a top level in secretarias or in decision-making positions that are trying to make a change. It's not from one year to another, but I think things are improving, and if we are competing with all those constraints we have, I think there is, with good leadership, there are a lot of opportunities to improve a lot, and I'm talking here specifically about Colombia more.
Thank you. Anyone else?
I do want to say something about leadership there, and so I think that the difficulty in thinking about leadership here, maybe I don't want to be too crude, but in Latin Americans usually we see leadership sort of as a synonym of having sort of an autocrat or an authoritarian regime that sort of like pushes through reforms and does things the way they want it to be. And I think the key thing here is how to think about leadership in terms of mobilizing the private sector, mobilizing civil servants around some of these goals. And it's, I mean, we're not doing it because it's very hard. I think in general, for the way I view our governments, for instance, it's much easier as a Latin American government, or specifically in Colombia, to show that you're having results. It's much easier to show a result by saying, I created a new agency, I have a new decree, I passed a new law, instead of I actually delivered results. And the part of actually delivering results, which is where you have to really have capacity as government, we haven't focused on that. And I think leadership in that term is how can we mobilize government in different levels for civil servants to think more about delivering results and less about having more regulation, more sort of facade. And I think this also applies to the private sector. In Colombia in general, and maybe this is also the case in other countries in Latin America, But we have had in the past companies that are, I mean, they are productive, they are creating jobs, but sometimes they are in a position of relative comfort because we don't have enough competition coming from maybe startups, entrepreneurs, but also from global trade. And in that position of being comfortable, then you don't also mobilize the right investments and the right things that you need to do to have a more productive capacity. So I think it's in both ways. We need to work in having a private sector that is more that is a leader in terms of pushing that companies get more productive, but also a government that thinks more about delivering results.
Yeah, as a lawyer, I think there is also an interesting legal issue there, because at least in Brazil, and I think it should be the same for the rest of the region, if you work for a private sector, you can do anything that is not forbidden in the law. If you work for the public sector, you can only do what is provided for in the law. And if you get too aggressive and you want to deliver the results, you can be personally liable for that. Yeah. So this is something that should be changed, I think.
Yeah, I think that risk aversion in the public sector as a result of personal liability is the Gordian knot. If you could get rid of that, a huge amount of energy would start to enter into the public sector and create more opportunities for the private sector. But how you get rid of that, I have no idea.
And that's why a lot of very good people don't work in the public sector. A lot of people that are in the private sector, they say, and I will probably agree with that, I will never work in the public sector because that you have that personal liability and it will completely change your life if something goes wrong. So yeah.
I used to be based in India, and there's a very famous economist in India called Kaushik Basu, who used to be the World Bank chief economist. And I heard him speak about the correlation between the levels of trust in society and economic growth. And in a sense, the more laws you have, it seems to me, the lower the levels of trust there are, because you need some kind of protocol to keep things working. Whereas in certain societies where there are high levels of trust, you don't need that. And I think that's an interesting topic for another day. I'm going to move on to, I'm going to combine two of the Chevening themes for really my last question to the panelists as a moderator, and then I'm going to open it up to everyone else. So please start thinking about questions that you'd like to ask. But the two big topics are networking and links to the UK. What I want to know is the UK underperforms in this region in terms of trade and investment. Well, particularly in terms of trade. Investment is relatively high. It's still not as high as it's been traditionally. If you go back 100, 200 years, it used to be the largest investor in the region by a long way. It's now probably about the third or fourth largest investor. But in terms of trade, we're really underperforming. We underperform our competitors in France, Germany, Spain, and Italy, and our ambition across the entire region is to reach those standards. So, what can I'm going to ask this question in two parts. One is, why is that happening? What is it that's preventing UK businesses from being more active, competitive, and doing more trade with Latin America? And the second question is, what, as a network, the Chevening network, I mean, could we do to enhance trade and investment between Latin America?
I have some comments. I think I have said this before in other events, but in my work, I think I have two marketing tasks to do. The first one, and the obvious one, is to sell the company I work for, Arup, in Colombia. And the second one, that is not that obvious, is to sell Colombia inside Arup. The company has 40,000 employees around the world. So the first one is sometimes a lot easier than I thought, because a lot of people like you guys have studied abroad or have a relationship with our company. So when I go to meetings, I start talking about Arup. They know the company, they have some friends, they live in Australia and saw it, so that facilitated us a lot. The second part sometimes is difficult because we Colombia and other Latin American regions are the same, are still seen as with a lot of risk, a lot of bad image we still have, and that's a shame, because that was something that I believe has changed a lot, and was bad image from few people in the 80s, the 90s, that it still hurt us a lot. So for me, a lot of times it's more difficult to convince people to do business in Colombia, that it's not dangerous to come here, and the easy solution for that is to bring them here for a week. Once they come here, go to meetings, see the city, everything, they know what they're talking about, and they always want to come back. There is this image in Latin America that companies, they don't pay the invoices, it's very difficult to recover debt. Actually, in my experience, in 4 years, we have only had one problem with an invoice, and it was from a Swedish client. In Colombia, we don't have any problems with invoices. Of course, we do a good job of selecting clients, and we don't work for everyone. We do our due diligence of selecting clients. So I think selling the Colombia image or Latin American image is a task that we all do, and is very difficult. It's a step by step, but it's something we all can help, and especially people that study abroad and has links with international companies, is to sell the country and tell them their experience, bring people here. When they come here, they always want to come back. So I think that is we could do a lot trying to improve that, and that will improve the confidence of UK firms coming to Colombia and doing more business.
Yeah, I think what it's would be really essential to improve on that front would be to unlock the potential of trading between smaller business of the region and smaller business of the UK, because of course if you are a big company, you have many resources to decide to take a decision if you are trading or not. You have all the information that you need. You can hire big firms, law firms, auditors, and all of that. But the problem lies when you are a smaller firm and the cost of doing that gets too high, and you decide to do it yourself. Then you have the language barrier, which I think it's still a very important one, because the government does not communicate well in another language. So I'm pretty sure that if a smaller entrepreneur from the UK wants to have information on how to trade with Brazil, it's going to be very difficult for him to do it without a local assistance. And this is not something difficult to change. You know, it just takes, I think, the will to have a more open and professional communication with the other parts of the world. This could certainly help in my point of view.
I think there's also something, well, many things that, for instance, our governments, our companies in Latin America can do, because I think we have been accustomed to a type of investment that is usually related to natural resource extraction. That's a relatively easy diplomacy or investment diplomacy to do, because you just have companies from all over the world just coming and trying to look where the natural resources, what's going to be the royalty agreement, and then we'll do the investment. That's a relatively easy job to do. It's much harder to think about investments that want to go beyond natural resources and think about, I don't know, other sectors, do R&D in our countries, those types of more efficiency-based foreign direct investments. We're not accustomed to looking for those. We're not accustomed to having the right set of institutions to go search for those investments, to how to deal with those investments, to how to do the legal work. That's a much harder job to do, and we haven't been accustomed to that. Maybe it's not our fault. It's just because we've had just so much activity in the natural resource sector that we haven't been exposed to that type of work. And I think that's something that can be a deliberate action from our governments to sort of diversify into those types of investments, and that would be key for changing things with the UK, because that's the type of investments that I think the infrastructure programs have shown that we can do that we can go beyond just natural resources and think about more complicated deals, more sophisticated long-term projects, and we can learn from infrastructure and then start to diversify from that.
If I can answer my own question, if you take the liberty of allowing me to do that, and thinking more on the point about what can this network do to bring more British businesses to this network. I think there are two things that I would say based on personal experience. First is that in business, personal relationships are more important than almost anything else. You know, we assume, based on economic theory, that businesses make rational decisions and will invest in the place where you know, they will get the highest returns, but businesses have no idea where that is. I mean, you know, especially if you're a small business, going to your point, you have no idea whether you're going to make better returns in Colombia or in Vietnam. So what's going to bring you to Colombia or to Brazil or to Bolivia? It's because you met some guy on a plane who seemed like a nice person who you could trust, and they they sold you on the great energy and innovation that was going on in Medellin, for example, which is you know, that's what really happens in real life, not in economic theory. So I think that you guys are, as a network, have huge connections. You're all on LinkedIn, and you know, probably if we multiplied the number of contacts that every single person here has on LinkedIn, you could reach out to a huge number of businesses and be selling them the opportunities in Latin America, and helping creating those people-to-people links. But another more theoretical way to look at this is arbitrage. And businesses really understand arbitrage. And to me, there's a huge information gap between what's really going on in Latin America and what people think is going on in Latin America. And that is an arbitrage opportunity, and that's something that businesses will also be very attracted to, because if they can, if they know better what's happening here and how easy it is to do business here, relatively speaking, to what they thought it was, and how safe it is, relatively speaking, to what they thought it was, and what their competitors think it is, then they have an opportunity. And I think that's a very strong selling point, you know, especially for a place like Colombia, but I'm sure for the rest of your countries too. So those are my words of wisdom. I want to open it up. We've got like about half an hour, which is quite a long time, but we don't need to use it all. But I can see lots of hands being raised, which is great. Could I ask you just to say who you are, and where you come from, and anything else you want to say about yourself? If you got married on Chevening or anything like that, that would be great. If you have Chevening babies. But if you could also say, if you want to ask the question to all the panelists or just to one specific panelist.
Thank you. I'm not Chevening. I am ILP, and I was invited here. And I'm Claudia Calvin. I'm from Mexico. And I have a question that any four of you could answer. And it's a question and sort of a frustration, a bit of frustration. Whenever I go to panels on trade in Latin America, Mexico seems to be out of the panel. And as we're talking about trade, my question would be, why is it that no one mentioned the North American free trade? I mean, I know we're negotiating it, but NAFTA is a strong reference of trade in the region. And Mexico has bilateral trade with almost every single country, and we're like one of the major investors in the region. And the renegotiation of NAFTA also will have a strong effect in every single one of the countries we're having trade with. Whatever happens will affect the trade with every one of the countries, and will have an impact in the region. And regarding the UK, of course, we're the UK is the 5th most important trade partner for Mexico. And yeah, we're working strongly with the UK to strengthen the trade. And now as we're renegotiating the trade with the UAE and the visit of last year of your trade representative. So the round of question would be, what is your perspective of the trade with Mexico? We're part of the Pacific Alliance, and of course it's really important for us. But NAFTA will affect also trade in Latin America. And I have this feeling that whenever I am in these forums of Latin America, Mexico doesn't seem to be from the other standpoint, part of Latin America. I mean, I know we have this strong negotiation and tie with North America, but yeah, or is it that Latin America really doesn't exist and we just speak the same language? I know.
Okay, I'm gonna let whichever panelist wants to speak first.
Okay. I do want to say something about Mexico because I don't know if you remember, but when I said in general we have very low productivity, very low export sophistication and diversification, with exceptions. My exception was Mexico in my presentation because in general Mexico, and I have some data for Mexico there, the just being exposed to trade through NAFTA has had such a big impact on the way that business, investment, deals, export have sophisticated in Mexico, that right now you're the leaders in terms of how complex your productive development is, and you're winning the battle even against China in U.S. markets. So that's a big exception in terms of how Latin America has done and has performed, and I think part of it has had to do with having the opportunity to be in a free trade agreement such as NAFTA, but also to have the vision to couple that trade agreement with sort of regional work on cluster development, for instance, that has had big economic impact in places like Puebla, and having international investment come in not just to take advantage of the Mexican market, but to base highly sophisticated industrial production in Mexico as a platform to export to the rest of the world. And I think that those are sort of key examples of how you can become a really sophisticated and a global player in exports, specifically in high value-added exports. That's not to say that everything is okay with Mexico, and we have also some common problems, for instance, in terms of informality. When you take a look at informality in Mexico, you see that even though you have this sort of like spots of excellence and export sophistication, you also have a huge sector that is sort of left behind in terms of not being able to access that higher productivity, and that's a challenge that I think we have in all of Latin America. But that's what I would say to Mexico. I think it's one of the big exceptions, and it's an example as part of Latin America, as part of the Pacific Alliance.
Hello, I have it.
I'm gonna let Federico answer this question, and then we'll go
30
on.
seconds. Just to answer your question, why we don't include in Mexico, I think we are ignorant. We need to apologize because Mexico is part of Latin America. But in a personal way, the way I see it is they're so close to the States, to North America, that we think, or at least I think, I cannot generalize here, I think that everything is quite easy. You are there, you have it over there, so you don't need to be part of these forums because everything is solved. Probably it's not true, and that's what I say is ignorance, but I think that's the reason why, because we see that you are so close, or in some things that you are North America, sometimes you are considered as North America. So, but it's not right, and that's the good things about all these panels, and you doing this question like that really make us think, oh, you are right, we should consider Mexico, and of course you are part of Latin America, we speak the same language, and I'm sure you want to have more trade, and I'm sure you have some issues, and you don't have all your problems solved because you are next to the States and have a very good relationship with them, or at least.
I would just add is when we're talking about regional leadership in terms of being a more free trade beacon for the rest of the world, then obviously the outcome of what happens in the NAFTA negotiations is going to make a huge impact in terms of Mexico's outlook. If there's a successful negotiation, then, well, I think that's a good economic story for all of Latin America, because it improves supply chain opportunities and supports open markets across Latin America and North America. But if it were to go the other way, then I think the reaction of Mexico, and which other markets do you turn to supplement what you may lose through a NAFTA negotiation, then there is an opportunity to expand more on the Pacific Alliance, which was mentioned a lot, and obviously Mexico is the largest country in the Pacific Alliance. So I think there are opportunities there. I'm going to go to the next. question.
Yes, hello. I am Mauro. I'm from Uruguay. I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you. I'm a political scientist, so I see all this discussion maybe from a different perspective. And maybe I'm going to play a little bit of the devil's advocate for a minute. Just to say that regarding your presentation, Rafael, that was really, really enlightening with a lot of data, very interesting. Something that you didn't mention that, at least in my opinion, is very important to think about these issues is that another tendency that Latin America has experienced during the last decade is the primarization of the economy, and that primarization was particularly enhanced by the boost in the demand of the Chinese economy for our commodities and so on. So is it so simple to think that unlimited free markets and opening our markets is the answer for to a pathway of development of our economies, when we see that, just to see a little bit of history, you know, like in the 80s and in the 90s, that was what we did during the consensus of Washington recipes and opening our economies. And obviously that had some benefits, as you mentioned, but it also had a lot of negative effects in terms of local economies, in terms of unemployment that boosted during those years, a lot of industries that we used to have, that we lost them, and so on. And then maybe from the perspective of companies that just are interested in making profit, that's the answer, like to opening the barriers and not having any regulation. But from a more holistic perspective, thinking about our countries as a whole, sustain some degree of protectionism, some degree of regulation in some strategic sectors of some emerging economies, some innovative sectors that we can have. Maybe that's another pathway to development that we are not considering, because we are just like maybe advocating for a pathway to development which is only based on openness and unlimited openness. And I'm not talking about investment. Obviously we need foreign investment, but that idea of opening the markets irrestrictively and letting our industries just go there, compete and die, that's what's going to happen. Well, I don't know if that's a great idea, but okay.
So did you say that you went to the LSE?
Yeah, I did. Of course.
In the 70s?
No, now. But yeah, but it's very ideological too, to think that free market is the answer to every problem. That's ideology too. It's not ideology only when that's a criticism.
That's a key discussion. I always like to mention an economist, that's Danny Rodrik. Well, Danny, I think, has a great view on this, and he says, look, countries like Latin America tried sort of import substitution and import protection in the 50s, 60s, and sometimes 70s. It failed miserably, but then we went sort of like a pendulum to the other side, and then we tried openness freely. And I think, if I would say we didn't fail as miserably as in the 50s and 60s, but we did find out that if you just do one part and you don't do the other, then you're doomed to just exporting natural resource-based goods. And if you don't have sort of active policies to take advantage of those trade opportunities, then you won't get very far. I always point out that even though you do need to facilitate regulation and to sort of be more embedded into openness of global trade, you do need to have the right infrastructure and logistics. I mean, if you don't invest truly into solving these problems of actually getting your products out there, you're putting your businesses in a comparative disadvantage when you have to compete with this like highly globalized, very efficient companies all over the world. So that's one key part. But I think the other is in terms of having the right export structure, the right set of business entrepreneurial capacity, productivity, that has to be part of the answer. And I think countries like ours do need to think about active, productive development policies that are based not on protecting from imports, but from, as you said, from innovation, R&D, into thinking about how can we diversify our capacities. And I do like to think about imports not as a competition, because it's a different world right now to what we had in the 60s. We now have a world that's more based on global value chains, in which you can have extremely high imports, but if those imports are part of your transformation process and you add value to them and then export at a higher value, that's fine by me. It's not about restricting imports, but it's more about how can we take advantage of those value chains and have a productive development policy that gains us more capabilities. So I like to think that Roderick is right on that. We need to do both.
Whoever has the microphone can go next.
Good morning. Thank you very much. My name is Sandra. I'm from Mexico. And I was just thinking about a very specific topic of how do you incorporate disaster risk management into the trade opportunities? Because Latin America is a very prone area, and as you said, Rafael, the Pacific Alliance just issued a cat bond for earthquakes for, of course, Mexico, Peru, Colombia, and Chile, but there are so many other hazards that haven't been considered, and I think this specific topic is important because it can help to the supply chain resilience and the continuity of operations plans in the region for trade. So I just want to listen to your perspectives on this issue. And we have another question.
Yeah, I think if we take maybe 2 or 3 questions at once because we're running a little bit.
Okay. Sorry, Eduardo Mac, Chevening, Brazil. It's not a question; it's just a reflection for the other groups. I think we didn't address the Mercosur issue. It's very interesting that I remember the time Mercosur was implemented. It was so exciting to think that I could buy alfajores from Argentina cheaper, and wine and leather jackets from Uruguay cheaper. It didn't happen. We buy wine from Argentina and Brazil, still very expensive. So the reason why I'm bringing that up is because we don't seem to have in our region a long-term vision for implementation of benefits for the region. We don't have parties that address and embrace challenges in the name of the best for the country. Some things go a little bit in one way, and then another party takes on power and stops progress. So I don't think we have a tradition in our region of carrying things forward in the long term. So I just wanted to put that on the table for us as we go into our breakout sessions to think about culturally what can we do to change the way we operate. That is not, we do not as a continent, I don't believe, have a long-term attitude and vision to move forward.
And I would like to add a third question, something else that has not been addressed, and I would like to know your opinion. Like, we know we're living in a rapidly changing world, and there's a very interesting approach from Sussex University, Transformative Innovation Policy Consortium, and what it says is like, okay, we're building, it's specifically for innovation policy. We're building innovation policy in a traditional way, like for 20th century problems. Now we're facing different challenges, 21st century challenges. And regarding trade, we're also facing not just challenges related to sustainability, but we also have some topics such as the fourth industrial revolution, automation, in artificial intelligence, even cryptocurrencies. So I was wondering, what's your perspective about the region? Are we really getting prepared? What should we do to get prepared? Because it's very common to see those topics not get considered in panels like this.
Just a short question that is connected with Mercosur. And I was thinking about, when we were discussing about Mercosur, new trade opportunities with the UK, we have been, the people who is a member of the Mercosur, trying to negotiate with the EU for years a kind of agreement with the Mercosur and the EU. It's not possible. We also have the main opposition from Spain and France because of agricultural products, but not the opposition from the UK. So maybe for Francisco, that's Brazilian or whatever, what do you think if we can have now the opportunity? Of course, the UK need to have a deal with the EU first, but maybe in a second or third chapter of have an opportunity to have a kind of deal with the UK and Mercosur. Thank you.
Okay, I'm not going to take any more questions. I'm going to let the panelists answer the 4 that we've had. So we'll start with the guy who's from Brazil or wherever.
Yeah, again, I think we always go back to political will. I think if we find the right political will in our respective countries, I do believe it will be possible to get an agreement between the Mercosur and the European Union. And this is something that we need to look forward to.
Federico, do you have?
The first question about disaster management. I want to explain what we have in the company I work for. We have a group of people, specialists in structural engineering, or other engineers that you need, that are on hold. And every time something happens in the world, I get an email the next morning saying of these groups who is available to travel tomorrow to that area and help with the crisis. So in the experience close by, Ecuador had an earthquake. It was what, 2 years ago, a year and a half ago. The following day we had an email, do you have someone from Colombia that has this experience that could go? And the following day, so like 30 hours after the earthquake, we had people from the States, from the UK, from Colombia, traveling to the site, spending 2 weeks and a half there, checking all the buildings that were still standing and checking if those buildings were okay or they needed to be demolished because of what they suffered in the earthquake. And it was a team not worried about everything that was going on with all the helping people and everything, just focusing on what they know is the buildings. And we have a lot of programs like that, and that generates trade, because we had people from all over the world going to Ecuador. In this case, we had someone from our office, and we have those types of programs to help with disaster management. We have also wanted to use here, and I think if you want to do something, is how to prevent disasters. So we are trying to do internal projects with people from Colombia and people from other offices to give some tools so we can create a lot of the disasters. You cannot prevent the earthquake, but you can prevent the damage, and especially the number of lives that are lost on those disasters. So I think it's something I want to explain what we're doing, and there are a lot of opportunities doing that, but this is not the only company that has things like that going on.
And I mean, I think just one of the interesting things is to look at trade from a consumer's perspective. So when you were talking about the ability to buy Argentinian wine in Brazil for decent prices, I mean, I think that often the debates around trade forget consumers altogether, and think almost entirely in the context of the producers. But you know, one of the great benefits of more openness and lower tariffs is that consumers can buy more products for cheaper prices and have higher levels of utility. And there are a lot of people in the UK that would like to buy avocados cheaper from Colombia, but you know, so and I would certainly love to be able to buy Chilean wine cheaper whilst I'm here. So I think that's another side to the debate, which often gets forgotten. Can I open it up to? There's quite a lot of questions, so let's just. Like I said, whoever's got the microphone can speak.
Hi. Hi, so I'm Maria Alexandra Castellanos. I come from Ecuador. I studied economics at UCL with a Chevening scholarship. So my question comes in the context of Brexit. According to the IMF, leaving the European Union has the potential to reshape the structure of the British economy. So I would like to ask, what opportunities do you perceive that may arise in the state of affairs in terms of trade and investment between Latin America and the UK from Brexit? And also, what are the challenges associated with this?
Okay, let's take another couple of questions.
Hi. I'm Daniel from Chile. I studied a MSc in Management, Information Systems and Digital Innovation. And I would like to ask for all the panel, we are in an increasingly digitized world, so that's a fact. And perhaps if we don't get what does it mean, we run the risk of underperform even more than we are doing now. So 2 questions regarding that. First, do we really understand in your fields of expertise what does it mean to be in a digitized economy? And the other question is, from your perspective, from your fields, what do you think are the main challenges, the main effort we should do to leverage the potential of economy, of that digital economy? Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to pass over to.
Yeah, artificial intelligence was mentioned a couple of times here, and I think this is something that really, I think it presents an opportunity and it also a challenge. It's certainly an opportunity for more trade with the UK, because I'm sure that the UK can export software and services associated with artificial intelligence that will be useful to any industry in Latin America. To give you my example in my field of expertise, all the law firms now are really concerned that they need to be engaged with artificial intelligence to make sure that they can unlock the potential of that and not be simply forgot about because the computers are now able to provide legal services in a much more efficient way than junior lawyers do. So it is, I think, something to get concerned about, but also a good opportunity to open more avenues with the UK.
I will answer your question about Brexit. I think we're seeing the good consequence here, and is the UK needs to explore a lot of more opportunities to do business with other regions. It cannot depend on the European Union, and they're doing that. And I don't know how aware the people are here about this. The Prosperity Fund is a fund from the British Embassy looking for work abroad for British companies, or at least a part has to be done by British company. And the Prosperity Fund has been existing, I don't know, for many years. We have done work for that, but the one that is coming this year is is another ballpark figure number. The funds for the Prosperity Fund right now are 10 times higher, or you can correct me how much they are higher. 25. Okay, 25 times higher, because they're looking to do more business with other regions, and that's something that we're seeing today. We can maybe get some work with the Prosperity Fund this year. So it's things like that that the UK needs to look at other parts of the world, because if they don't do it, probably their business are going to suffer a lot.
I think in terms of sort of the fourth industrial revolution, sort of the new way to do innovation, digital technologies, I think in general, in Latin America, we haven't understood sort of the potential impacts that those sort of transformative technologies can have. We usually maybe think that, look, this happened when we had the computers, and we thought that computers would wipe out jobs and we would have high unemployment, but then sort of those jobs reinvented themselves, and now we have sort of more sophisticated people doing things with computers. But every time I talk about this with people who truly understand sort of these new digital technologies, they always say this time is different. I don't know what they see. Maybe you can tell us more about it. But there are some people that are very knowledgeable in this that are really worried that this time could be different. That the fact that this can have sort of like exponential changes. Maybe it won't be that easy for all that informal jobs, sort of low-skilled jobs that are going to be replaced, to reinvent themselves, and this won't happen as easily as we had in the past. So maybe we do have a sort of a big economic and social wave that is going to go through our countries, and we haven't seen it yet. And I do think because we have such high informality that we could be at very high risk, and we're not truly understand why this time it could be different. But maybe you can tell us a bit more about why.
Yeah, I think that there's definitely a trend that we're talking about, which is very interesting in terms of kind of the digitization, if you call it that, or fourth industrial revolution. When the first industrial revolution happened, people in the UK said that it was going to be very dangerous to get on trains, because if they moved more than 10 miles an hour, then their heads would explode, which didn't turn out to be the case. So there's always a lot of fear when new technology comes in, and people get very anxious about it. But I do think that it's definitely creating a political impact, and the economic impact could be very positive in terms of productivity, which is one of the big challenges, because we've pretty much exhausted all the productivity gains that came in the 80s and 90s from the first round of IT revolution, and so there is potentially a huge productivity opportunity in new technology. But I think there's also a social opportunity, and maybe a place like Uruguay or some of the smaller countries in the region which have the capacity to be innovative in terms of social issues and things like the basic income. You know, exactly. So, you know, there's something there around the future of work and the future of civilization in the context of artificial intelligence, where actually Latin America has the opportunity to do something different and maybe put itself on the map in terms of social and economic policy. I think we have, can I just ask the conference team, do you want me to finish in 3 minutes, or do you want us to go on 10 more? Okay, we can have 10 more minutes.
Well, one topic that, well, sorry, my name is Dante Ruiz. I am from Mexico. I am also an economist. And one topic that has been overlooked in this panel, and mostly in panels around international trade, is the role of climate change. Climate change is casting a big shadow on international trade, especially in Latin America, because we are a region that is highly exposed to phenomena that are going to take place when climate change starts to, well, it's already taking place around the continent. And I would like to know what's the perspective on the panel without getting like really technical, because this can get like highly sophisticated. But what's the view of you around how international trade has to take into account environmental impacts and pushed to green growth?
Okay. Should I? Okay. Hi, my name is Edward Perez. I'm Venezuelan. I actually had 3 questions, all related. I'll be very brief with each of them. Resuming what Jeff said as one of his final remarks regarding arbitrage as one of the measures that any network, civil society, the private sector could use to try to promote trade in, or actually investment in America, in Latin America. First question would be, arbitrage and all of those others confidence-building measures that have to be developed, do you believe, all of you in the panel, that we should approach them as a bloc, as a Latin American bloc, or given that you mentioned that there were many cultural particularities, should these confidence-building measures be developed case by case, or like individually, or maybe within sub-regions or something else? This mainly taking into account what has already been posted over there about the question about what the Chevening Network could do for Latin America. I think your perspective on this matter, on whether to approach it as a block or whether to approach it case by case, would be relevant for those purposes. The second question would be, do you think there are confidence-building measures that could be developed apart from arbitrage from the private sector and from civil society, given that most of the debate has been has taken into account political will and regulations, which are something that are more prompt to be regulated, well, to be a matter of the public sector. What confidence-building measures could the private sector or civil society promote? And the third one's something more related to my area of expertise. One of the confidence-building measures that I believe could be promoted, but from the public sector, is investment treaties like NAFTA, like Mercosur, and other bilateral investment treaties. There is a trend in Latin America that many bilateral investment treaties, recent bilateral investment treaties, are incorporating issues regarding human rights within the bilateral investment treaties. Given that there's a tension between openness against regulations, and human rights issues tend to be very related to regulations, how do you think would how would you think these human rights matters could be compatible with promoting openness or promoting like better conditions or less regulated conditions for foreign investors in the region. Thank you.
I will try to answer, well, with one answer, two questions. And it was the first question about climate change and human rights is give an example of the work we're doing, how and regulation, how could you allow out, what do we have here? We're building new roads in Colombia. It's a huge program, have never done before. It needs international finance. It needs the multilateral agencies, IDB is around, CAF, international banks, Goldman Sachs, Brazilian banks, everyone has there. And they have their own regulations. Like they need, every project needs to follow the Ecuador principles about environmental principles, taking account the climate change, about human rights. And it's very easy, they put the money. So they put the money, they put the rules, and everyone here in Colombia, it doesn't matter what is the local regulation, needs to do projects that has Ecuador principles that are not actually in our regulation, but are in international regulation, but because the people who is putting the money, they say they have to do it, everyone is doing that and we allowed it. So it's something that if you have to, it can be done. So taking into account climate change, taking into account human rights in the different countries and everything, and it's not something wrong that they're asking, is progressive, is the way forward. Of course it can be done here, and we're seeing a good example in projects that normally they didn't take into account all of that. They didn't spend any money looking at those things, and now they're spending a good amount of money complying with this, because if they don't do it, they're not going to get the money to build what they need to build. So I try to answer a little bit two questions.
Yeah, I think I agree that sort of more free trade and investment doesn't necessarily go against climate change. I think a lot of the solutions require international collaboration, investment, and I think in general, sort of future trends of exports are going to be every time sort of more concentrated on the exports of highly value-added goods that perhaps are not, I mean, perhaps their carbon footprint isn't as high as what we generally export right now. Export of services can be done through the internet. I mean, I don't necessarily see that there's a big conflict between higher trade and climate change, and I think a lot of international collaboration will help to prevent some of the challenges of climate change. But I wanted to talk more about sort of in terms of either we should do more as a block or case by case. In the case of the Pacific Alliance, I think it does show that working as a block has great implications in terms of not only your sort of negotiating power of the table, but also just being heard. I mean, if you talk about a country that is 40 million people and you're knocking on doors, maybe it's not something that gets your attention right away, but if you're talking about, I don't know, maybe 300 million people in a block that are talking and have the same vision, it's a much more critical value proposition. So I do think that working as a block has its key benefits, but again, it's very hard to do, and you have to think long term. And in terms of just a discussion about sort of you were saying that, for example, human rights considerations are being inserted into things like investment negotiations and investment investment agreements, and that sort of goes against regulation. I mean, I do think that sometimes regulation can help and can give a capacity for government to prevent things like human rights violations, but other times I go back to my story that usually Latin American countries, and I'm thinking about the case of Colombia, not only at a national level but subnational governments, when they want to show that they're doing something about human rights violations or violations to environment laws, what they do is they set up a new regulation and they prohibit something specific, but they don't really think about their capacity to enforce that regulation and their capacity to actually again, I'm going back just to having deliver results, and this is just an anecdote, but a few weeks ago we had a big problem in Colombia because we had a crisis in some of the jungle being brought down by deforestation and huge human caused fires, and the response by the Ministry of the Environment wasn't to go and crack down the illegal structures and the narco structures that were doing that. The response was to set up a decree that says that they prohibited to sell chainsaws. So, I mean, that's the type of regulations that we end up getting because that's how you show results, but you don't actually go and do the work. And when you have more and more rules prohibiting things, then you have the formal companies, businesses, entrepreneurs trying to do things right, and it's ever more costly to do things right. But then the illegal and informal structures keep on doing sort of the same work. So that's why I think it's not clear to me that having more regulation is a way to prevent some of those human rights violations or environment problems.
Okay, I think we're out of time. It's remarkable how many questions I was able to see, and I think how many more you guys wanted to ask. Normally when I go to conferences or when we do events in the embassy, you go, any questions, and everybody looks at somebody else and says, please do it because I don't want to. We've obviously got a very good recruitment process when it comes to picking people for Chevening, because you guys are all demonstrating your leadership qualities and your networking ability and your success. Let me thank all the panelists for both giving up their time to be here today. We appreciate that you're all incredibly busy and you have important jobs to do, and so sharing your ideas and opinions with this group is very much appreciated. I think we had a really kind of wide-ranging discussion. It kind of jumped about in lots of different directions, but a lot of the themes that we touched upon in terms of sustainability, human rights, anti-corruption, and environment will be touched upon in other sessions. So I think that's really exciting. I think from the UK government's perspective, trade is a huge priority for us, and supporting bilateral trade and investment ties between the UK and each one of your countries is such a huge priority for us. It's always been a priority. We've always been an open trading nation, but even more so today in terms of Brexit. We are increasingly looking to support British businesses and to create global markets for ourselves. But as you also know, Latin America is a big uphill struggle for us in terms of getting British businesses interested. There are historic ties that are a little bit closer to home. There are less language barriers in places like North America and lots of parts of Asia where there are Commonwealth ties to the UK. So I think we have collectively a big agenda to support those relationships and to strengthen them. A lot of when you're doing business with each other, you also create a huge amount of other forms of contact, social, environmental, human rights, can all be addressed once you're trading partners and strengthened. So I think I'll leave you with that thought, but thank you very much and enjoy the rest of the conference. Now I think you have to, Nicola's going to explain to you how to go into groups.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much, Jeff, and to all those panelists. That was fantastic. Just to remind you, you'll have another opportunity to talk about some of these themes in the workshop towards the end of the day after the second panel. But for now, I'd like you all to see there are 8 flip charts around the room. We have already assigned facilitators for each of those 8 groups. So can you please go and join one of the 8 facilitators around the room. Please mix yourselves up as much as you can. And the facilitator will talk you through the question which we're hoping you'll be able to answer. I'll give you about half an hour. And then I'd just like one person from each group to give us a sort of 1-minute feedback on what the main points from your discussions was. So, yeah, enjoy.